They mocked the mountain man for buying a black bride. Laughter echoed through the dusty streets as he placed his last silver coin on the block, buying her freedom when no one else would. Folks called him a fool, said he'd lost his mind taking her up into the cold hills to his lonely cabin. But they didn't see what he saw, a woman with courage burning behind her eyes, and faith stronger than any man's hate. When winter hit, the town's children fell sick, and the only clean water came from the spring those same men tried to steal. Then came the fire, the false arrest, and a prayer that shook the whole valley. Because the woman they mocked held something no one expected, proof that the land, the water, and even their own salvation were hers by right. Now the same people who spat on her name kneel at her doorstep, begging for mercy. But what happens when grace belongs to the one they called unworthy? And when the truth buried in ashes rises at last, who will be the one left standing before God and man? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whistled through the empty streets of Silver Creek, cutting sharp and cold against Juan Pike's weathered face. His horse's hooves kicked up dust as they made their way past the collection of wooden buildings that made up the small mining town. After months alone in the high country, the noise and bustle of civilization felt like an assault on his senses. Juan adjusted his worn cavalry hat, pulling it lower to shield his eyes from the late afternoon sun. All he wanted was to replenish his supplies, coffee, ammunition, maybe some salt pork, and return to his cabin in the pines. The sooner he could leave this place behind, the better. The creak of wagon wheels and raised voices drew his attention to a crowd gathering near the livery stable. An auctioneer, red-faced and sweating despite the chill, stood atop a weathered wagon. His booming voice carried across the street as he gestured to the items laid out for sale. Tools, harnesses, a few scrawny chickens. "Next up, folks. Got something special here today." Juan's hand tightened on his reins as two men dragged forward a woman in chains. Her dress was torn and dirty, but she held her head high despite the fear in her dark eyes. The sight of those iron shackles made his stomach turn. "Charlie Mayfield here," the auctioneer announced, yanking her forward. "Good worker, knows her letters too. Being sold for debt labor, previous owner couldn't pay his bills, if you catch my meaning." He gave an exaggerated wink that drew cruel laughter from the crowd. The woman, Charlie, flinched at their jeers but kept her spine straight. Juan could see the trembling in her hands, though she tried to hide it. "Start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer called out. "Who'll give me 50 for this fine worker?" Silence fell over the crowd. A few men shuffled their feet, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Others called out cruel jokes and slurs that made Juan's jaw clench tight enough to ache. $40, the auctioneer tried again, his voice losing some of its bluster. 30? Juan's mind raced. He'd seen enough suffering during the war, watched too many people treated like property instead of human beings. The silver dollars in his pocket, meant for supplies, suddenly felt heavy as lead. Before he could think better of it, Juan urged his horse forward through the crowd. The animal's size made people step back, creating a path to the auction wagon. He could feel every eye on him as he reached into his coat and pulled out his money pouch. "How much?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. "Why, $30 would do it, mister." Juan counted out the silver coins and held them up. "She's free," he declared, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'll marry her if that's what the law requires." Shocked murmurs rippled through the crowd, followed by barks of disbelieving laughter. Juan ignored them, keeping his eyes locked on Charlie. She stared back at him, confusion and wariness warring on her face. "Now see here," the auctioneer sputtered. "You can't just—" "The law says she needs a husband or guardian," Juan cut in. "I'm offering both. Unless you'd rather explain to the territory marshal why you're conducting slave auctions 5 years after the war?" That shut the man up quick. He glanced nervously at the gathered crowd, then snatched the coins from Juan's outstretched hand. "Preacher!" Juan called out, spotting the familiar black coat of Preacher Harlan in the crowd. "We need your services, if you're willing." The old circuit rider stepped forward slowly, his lined face troubled. "This is unusual, Brother Pike. Are you certain about this?" Juan met Charlie's eyes again. She gave him the slightest nod, seeming to understand that while this wasn't ideal, it was better than the alternative. "I'm certain," Juan said firmly. Preacher Harlan sighed heavily, but pulled out his worn Bible. "Very well. Let's make this proper, at least." The ceremony that followed was brief and awkward, witnessed by the muttering crowd. Juan dismounted to stand beside Charlie, speaking the required words in his quiet way. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, the church bell above them tolled the hour, its deep bronze voice echoing across the town. Juan quickly removed his coat and wrapped it around Charlie's shoulders before helping her mount his pack mule. Her hands trembled as she gripped the saddle horn, but she managed to settle herself with dignity. "Much obliged," she whispered, the first words she'd spoken since he'd stepped forward. Juan just nodded, taking the mule's lead rope. The crowd parted before them as he led both animals toward the general store, protecting his new wife from the continuing stares and whispers. "Reckon you've lost your mind, Pike," someone called out. Others laughed and made cruder comments. Juan kept his eyes forward, his back straight. He'd seen enough of mankind's cruelty to last several lifetimes. Sometimes the only way to fight it was with quiet defiance and whatever kindness you could manage to show. The bell tolled its final note as they reached the store's hitching post. Juan tied both animals securely before turning to help Charlie down. She accepted his assistance with cautious grace, her chin lifted despite the tears he could see gathering in her eyes. "We'll get supplies," he told her softly. "Then head up to my cabin before dark. It's not much, but you'll be safe there." Charlie looked up at him, studying his face as if trying to read his true intentions. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders relax slightly. "Thank you," she said simply. "I won't forget this." Juan touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, then guided her toward the store's entrance. The bell's echoes had faded, but its tolling seemed to hang in the air, marking not just the hour, but the moment when both their lives had changed irrevocably. Behind them, the crowd slowly dispersed, their mockery fading into uneasy silence. The auctioneer's wagon creaked away down the street, empty now of its human cargo. And above it all, the autumn wind continued to blow, carrying with it the first hints of winter and change to come. The general store's bell tinkled as Juan held the door for Charlie. Inside, the shopkeeper's wife gasped softly at the sight of them, but quickly covered it with a professional smile. Juan could feel Charlie's tension as they moved through the narrow aisles, gathering the basics they'd need. Food, lamp oil, warm clothes for Charlie to replace her tattered dress. Through it all, Charlie maintained her composure, though Juan noticed how her hands still shook slightly when she touched the soft wool of a shawl or ran her fingers over a bar of soap. Such simple things, but he imagined they represented a kind of freedom she hadn't dared hope for just hours before. As they loaded their purchases onto the animals, the sun was already sinking toward the mountain peaks. Juan knew they had a long ride ahead through the gathering dusk, but something told him Charlie wouldn't mind. Every step their mounts took away from Silver Creek would be a step toward whatever future they might build from this strange beginning. Evening shadows stretched long across the mountain trail as Juan led their small party higher into the wilderness. The temperature dropped with each passing mile, bringing a sharp bite to the autumn air. Charlie pulled Juan's borrowed coat tighter around her shoulders, grateful for its warmth, despite the lingering scent of pine sap and wood smoke. The steady clip-clop of hooves on rocky ground filled the growing darkness. Juan rode ahead on his horse, while Charlie followed on the sturdy pack mule. Neither had spoken since leaving town, but the silence felt more like respect than rejection. The trail wound steadily upward through stands of aspen, their golden leaves trembling in the chill breeze. Charlie's muscles ached from the unfamiliar motion of riding, but she kept her discomfort to herself. Anything was better than the chains she'd worn mere hours ago. As they rounded a sharp bend, the forest suddenly opened before them. Charlie caught her breath at the view. Endless waves of pine-covered mountains stretching to the horizon, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The setting sun painted the clouds in brilliant shades of pink and gold. "Thank you," she said softly, the words carrying clearly in the mountain air. "For what you did back there." Juan's shoulders tensed slightly. He gave a small shrug without turning around, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. After a moment, he reached for the canteen at his saddle horn and passed it back to her. Charlie accepted it with both hands. Before drinking, she closed her eyes and whispered a brief blessing over the water. "The Lord provides in mysterious ways," she murmured, then took a careful sip. The water tasted of sweet mountain springs. They continued climbing until the light grew too dim to safely navigate the trail. Juan led them to a small clearing beside a creek, where the sound of rushing water mixed with the evening songs of crickets. "We'll camp here tonight," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Cabin's still half a day's ride." Charlie nodded, watching as he efficiently set up their simple camp. He strung a canvas tarp between two pines to create a shelter, then gathered wood for a small fire. His movements were precise and practiced, speaking of years spent in these mountains. While Juan tended to the animals, Charlie knelt beside her bedroll. The familiar words of prayer came easily, despite her exhaustion. "Lord, I thank you for delivering me from bondage," she prayed aloud, her voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Guide our path through these mountains, and grant us safety through the night." Juan paused in his work, listening but saying nothing. The firelight caught the edge of his profile, revealing a face weathered by sun and wind. Charlie couldn't read his expression, but something in his stillness suggested he was affected by her words. A chorus of coyotes began to howl in the distance, their wild voices echoing off the mountainsides. Charlie startled at the sound, but Juan seemed untroubled. "They won't come near the fire," he assured her, the first words he'd spoken in hours. "Try to get some rest. Dawn comes early up here." Charlie settled onto her bedroll, pulling the borrowed coat close around her. Despite her fears and uncertainties, the steady sounds of the creek and the warmth of the fire soon lulled her into sleep. She woke to pale dawn light filtering through the pines. The air was crisp enough to show her breath, and frost sparkled on the canvas above her head. Juan already crouched beside a small fire of glowing embers, carefully tending to a battered coffee pot. There was something almost shy in the way he moved around camp, as if unsure how to behave with another person present. When he noticed her watching, he quickly filled a tin cup with the steaming coffee and offered it to her. "Much obliged," Charlie said softly, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm metal. The rich aroma helped chase away the morning chill. They broke camp efficiently, Juan taking care to ensure every ember was extinguished before they departed. He helped Charlie mount the mule again, his hands strong but careful, as he gave her a boost into the saddle. The morning sun gradually warmed their backs as they resumed their climb into the mountains. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with lazy grace. Charlie watched it soar against the deep blue sky, feeling a strange kinship with the wild creature. The trail grew steeper, switching back and forth across the mountainside. Massive granite cliffs rose around them, making Charlie feel smaller with each passing hour. The silence of the high country wrapped around them like a blanket, broken only by the soft sounds of their mounts' hooves and the occasional cry of the hawk above. Juan seemed to grow more comfortable as they climbed deeper into his mountain domain. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he began pointing out landmarks with brief gestures. A lightning-struck tree that marked a turn in the trail, a specific rock formation that indicated they were getting close to water. Charlie found herself studying her unlikely savior when he wasn't looking. His clothes were worn, but well-maintained, speaking of a man who took care of what little he owned. The rifle across his saddle showed similar signs of careful use. Everything about him suggested someone who had chosen this solitary life deliberately, making the mystery of his intervention at the auction even deeper. The mountains seemed to swallow them in their vastness, until Charlie felt as though the world she'd known before had fallen away entirely. Yet somehow, in this strange new wilderness, she felt the first stirrings of something she hadn't dared hope for in years. Peace. They paused to rest the animals beside a small spring around midday. Juan shared some dried meat and hard biscuits from his saddlebags, carefully splitting the simple meal between them. When Charlie bowed her head to say grace before eating, she noticed him watching with an expression that might have been curiosity. The silence between them had shifted subtly since morning. Where before it had been born of awkwardness and uncertainty, now it felt more like a mutual recognition of something sacred in this shared journey. They were two people thrown together by fate and conscience, each carrying their own burdens, each offering what respect they could to the other's way of being. As they mounted up to continue their journey, Charlie caught Juan, watching her with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, he quickly looked away, but not before she saw something like concern in his gaze. It occurred to her that perhaps he was as uncertain about this arrangement as she was, yet determined to see it through with whatever grace they could muster. The hawk continued to circle overhead as they resumed their climb, its presence a reminder that in these mountains, even solitude had its witnesses. The trail stretched endlessly upward, leading them deeper into whatever future awaited in the high country's embrace. The sun hung directly overhead when Juan's cabin finally came into view. Charlie straightened in her saddle, studying what would now be her home. The small log structure nestled against a granite outcropping, partially sheltered by towering pines. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, dancing against the mountain sky. "Someone's been here," Charlie said, her voice tight with concern. Juan shook his head. "Banking box," he explained. "Keeps coals alive while I'm gone. Safer than starting fresh fires." He dismounted and helped Charlie down from her mule, his movements efficient but careful. Her legs trembled from the long ride, unused to so many hours in the saddle. Juan steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow until she found her footing. The cabin door creaked as Juan pushed it open. Warm air rushed out to meet them, carrying the scent of wood smoke and leather. Charlie followed him inside, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the dim interior. It was a simple space, but solid. Rough-hewn log walls rose to meet heavy timber beams overhead. A potbelly stove squatted in one corner, its black iron surface radiating welcome heat. Stacked pelts lined one wall: beaver, fox, and others Charlie couldn't name. Their rich colors added warmth to the rustic room. A narrow bed occupied the far corner, its wool blankets neat but worn. A wooden table with two mismatched chairs stood near the single window. Charlie's gaze settled on a shelf, where a solitary Bible rested, its leather binding cracked with age. Juan moved around the small space, opening the shutters to let in more light. He seemed uncomfortable having another person in his domain, his movements more hesitant than they'd been on the trail. "May I?" Charlie paused, then pressed on. "May I cook supper? I saw you had some potatoes in your saddlebag." Juan looked surprised but nodded. "Pans are there," he said, gesturing to hooks on the wall. "Flour and salt in the barrel." Charlie set to work, grateful for the familiar task. She found an apron hanging by the stove and tied it around her waist, then began gathering what she needed. The simple act of preparing food helped settle her nerves. As she sliced potatoes, an old hymn rose unbidden to her lips. The quiet melody filled the cabin. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound." She nearly stopped when she noticed Juan pause in his work of storing supplies, his back going, still at the sound of her voice. But he didn't object, so she continued softly as she cooked. The potato soup came together quickly, thickened with flour, and seasoned with the few herbs she found in Juan's stores. When it was ready, she ladled it into 2 wooden bowls and placed them on the table. Juan sat down across from her, looking uncertain. Before he could reach for his spoon, Charlie folded her hands and bowed her head. "Lord," she prayed, her voice clear in the quiet cabin, "we thank you for this food, for shelter from the cold, and for bringing me to a man who saw me as more than a price. Amen." Juan's head had dipped awkwardly at her words. When she looked up, she caught a flash of something raw in his expression before he focused intently on his soup. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. When they finished, Juan rose abruptly. "Need to chop more wood before dark," he said, reaching for his coat. "Storm's coming." Outside, Juan attacked the woodpile with more force than necessary. The rhythmic thunk of the axe echoed off the mountainside as he wrestled with his thoughts. What would people say when word spread about what he'd done? A mountain man taking a colored woman for his wife, even if it was only to save her from bondage, folks would talk. He paused to catch his breath, leaning on the axe handle. Through the cabin window, he could see Charlie moving about inside. She'd found a lamp and lit it against the gathering gloom. Her graceful figure passed back and forth as she tidied his scattered belongings, putting things right with quiet efficiency. Juan watched as she carefully straightened the Bible on its shelf, her fingers lingering reverently on its spine. She'd arranged his cooking implements more sensibly, swept the rough plank floor, and somehow made his bachelor cabin feel more like a home in just a few hours. The first snowflakes began to fall as he carried an armload of split wood inside. Charlie had coffee brewing on the stove, its rich aroma filling the small space. She poured 2 cups without asking and brought them to the chairs she'd arranged near the fire. Juan accepted his cup with a nod of thanks. They sat in silence, watching the flames dance behind the stove's glass window. The snow fell harder outside, blanketing the world in white silence. Neither seemed to know quite how to address the other. Husband and wife felt false on their tongues. They were strangers still, bound together by an act of mercy and a hasty ceremony. Yet something warmer than mere obligation had begun to grow between them, as delicate as the first spring flowers that would eventually push through the mountain snow. Charlie's quiet humming resumed as she dried their supper dishes. Juan found himself listening, letting the gentle melody wash over him like a balm. His cabin had never felt less empty, or more like the home it was meant to be. As darkness settled, fully outside, the snow continued to fall. The lamplight cast soft shadows on the log walls, and the fire crackled steadily in the stove. Juan and Charlie sat with their coffee, each lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow might bring, yet somehow comforted by the other's presence. 2 days had passed since Juan and Charlie's arrival at the cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows through the pines as Juan saddled his horse for the ride into town. They needed supplies: flour, salt, coffee, and other necessities that couldn't be trapped or foraged from the mountain. "I won't be long," Juan said, adjusting his rifle in its scabbard. Charlie stood in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. She nodded, trying to hide her concern. "Mind yourself," she said softly, "and thank you for the supplies." Juan touched the brim of his hat and rode out, his horse's hooves crunching through patches of lingering snow. The trail down to town seemed shorter than usual, his thoughts churning with worry about what reception awaited him. The general store's bell jangled as Juan pushed open the door. Conversation died immediately. Mrs. McLean stood behind the counter, her usually friendly face tight and closed. She suddenly found great interest in arranging penny candies in their glass jar. Juan moved through the store, gathering what they needed. His boots echoed on the wooden floor in the heavy silence. At the counter, he placed his items without speaking: flour, coffee beans, salt, lamp oil, and a few other necessities. Mrs. McLean tallied the purchases without meeting his eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote in her ledger. "That'll be $4.35, she said to the counter, rather than to Juan. As Juan counted out the money, he heard muttering from the corner where several men lounged near the pot-bellied stove. Their words carried clearly in the quiet store. "Heard he brought himself home a black bride," one said, just loud enough to be heard. "What's this town coming to?" "Ain't natural," another added. "Man ought to know better." Juan's hand tightened on his coins, but he kept counting. His jaw clenched as he placed the money carefully on the counter. Mrs. McLean swept it up quickly, still avoiding his gaze. As Juan gathered his purchases, Preacher Harlan entered the store. The old circuit rider's weathered face creased with concern when he saw the tension in the room. He approached Juan while the other men watched. "Brother Pike," the preacher said quietly, "might we speak outside?" Juan nodded stiffly and followed him onto the store's front porch. The preacher's eyes were kind, but worried as he spoke. "I want you to know I respect what you did," Harlan said, his voice low. "Saving that woman was a Christian act, but I must warn you, folk talk cruel when they fear change. They don't understand what they ain't used to." "I don't need their understanding," Juan replied, his voice rough with anger. The preacher sighed. "No, perhaps not. But remember, words can cut deeper than knives. Watch out for yourself and your wife both." Juan mounted his horse without replying, his purchases secured in his saddlebags. The ride home seemed longer, each hoofbeat echoing the muttered insults and sideways glances of the townspeople. Back at the cabin, Charlie had seized the mild weather as a chance to wash linens. She'd strung rope between 2 pines and hung the wet sheets to dry in the mountain breeze. The simple domestic task brought her peace after the tension of the past days. As she pinned the last pillowcase to the line, she heard hesitant footsteps approaching. Charlie turned to find a small boy standing at the edge of the clearing, watching her with curious eyes. He couldn't have been more than 11 or 12 years old. "Hello there," Charlie said gently, not wanting to frighten him away. Are you lost?" The boy shook his head. "No, ma'am. I'm Billy McLean. I work at my aunt's store sometimes." He scuffed his boot in the dirt. "I heard you singing yesterday when I was up here gathering pine nuts. It was pretty." Charlie smiled, touched by his shy honesty. "Would you like an apple? We have a few left from town." Billy nodded eagerly. Charlie went inside and returned with a red apple, polished bright on her apron. As she handed it to him, she saw the questions in his young face. "Why do people talk mean about you?" he blurted out, then looked down, embarrassed. "Sorry, Aunt Sarah said not to mention it." Charlie's heart ached, but she kept her voice gentle. "Some folks get scared of things that are different, Billy. But differences don't matter much to God. Only kindness does." She touched his shoulder lightly. "Mind kindness, not color. That's what my mama always taught me." Billy looked up at her, considering this. He bit into the apple and nodded slowly. "Your songs are still pretty, no matter what anyone says." The boy's simple acceptance brought tears to Charlie's eyes, but she blinked them away with a smile. "Thank you, Billy. You're welcome to visit again, if your aunt allows it." The sun was setting when Juan returned, his mood dark as storm clouds. He cared for his horse in sharp, angry movements before coming inside. Charlie had soup warming on the stove, its savory smell filling the cabin. "The store owner wouldn't even look at me," Juan said bitterly, hanging up his coat. "And the men, you should have heard how they talked." Charlie ladled soup into bowls as she listened to him recount the day's hurts. When he finished, she placed a bowl in front of him and sat down. "You gave me freedom," she said softly. "Don't let their hate take yours." Juan looked up, struck by her words. The anger in his face softened slightly as he met her steady gaze. "How can you be so calm about it?" he asked. "After everything you've been through?" Charlie stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Hate's a heavy thing to carry. I learned long ago to lay it down, or it would crush me." She smiled slightly. "Besides, not everyone's heart is closed. A young boy visited today, Billy McLean. He liked my singing." Juan's eyebrows rose in surprise. "The store owner's nephew?" Charlie nodded. "Sometimes the young see clearer than their elders. He didn't seem to mind my color at all, just wanted to know about my songs." They ate their stew by lamplight as the wind picked up outside, howling through the pines. But inside the cabin, something fragile and new was taking root. It wasn't love, not yet, but a sense of belonging, of shared purpose against the world's cruelty. Juan watched Charlie clear the bowls away, humming softly as she worked. The anger that had burned in his chest all day began to ease. Maybe she was right. Maybe the best revenge against hatred was to simply live well, to build something good and true despite what others might say. The wind rattled the windows, but the cabin stood firm. Inside, the lamp cast warm light on the log walls, and the fire crackled steadily in the stove. Together, they had created a shelter, not just from the mountain weather, but from the storm of prejudice that raged beyond their door. Morning frost glittered on the pines as Juan made his way down the narrow trail to check the spring. The small pool nestled at the mountain's foot had sustained him for years, its clear waters bubbling up from deep underground. Without it, life up here would be impossible. He dismounted near the spring's edge, boots crunching in the thin crust of snow. The water ran clean and strong despite the cold, just as it always had. Juan knelt to fill his canteen, listening to the quiet music of flowing water against stone. "Fine morning, friend." The voice startled him. Juan's hand instinctively moved toward his belt as he turned, but he kept his movements controlled, deliberate. A well-dressed man stood on the opposite bank, his black coat too fine for these mountains. Everything about him spoke of eastern cities, his polished boots, his carefully trimmed mustache, the gold watch chain that gleamed at his vest. "Name's Elias Gentry," the man said, touching the brim of his hat. "Railroad operations foreman for the Denver and Rio Grande." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Just surveying the valley for our new line." Juan straightened slowly, keeping his face neutral. "This is private land." "Oh, I'm well aware." Gentry's boots crunched in the snow as he walked the spring's perimeter, studying the flow. "But you see, railroads need water. Steam engines are thirsty beasts." He paused, looking directly at Juan. "We'll be requiring all accessible water sources along the route. Company policy, you understand." Juan spat into the snow, deliberately missing Gentry's polished boots by inches. "This spring's spoken for." "Everything has a price, friend." Gentry's smile turned cold. "Best remember that." They stood in silence for a long moment, measuring each other. Finally, Gentry touched his hat. Again. "Good day to you, and to your wife." The pause before the last word carried clear meaning. Juan watched him pick his way back up the slope, disappearing into the trees. Only when Gentry was gone did he allow his fists to unclench. The sun had set by the time Juan finished his other chores, checking trap lines, splitting wood, patching a loose shingle on the roof. Inside the cabin, Charlie had soup bubbling on the stove. The familiar smell of beans and salt pork usually brought comfort, but tonight his appetite had fled. "Something's troubling you," Charlie said as she ladled soup into his bowl. It wasn't a question. Juan told her about the morning's encounter, watching her face carefully. "Railroad wants the spring," he finished. "Man like that, he'll find a way to take it." Charlie was quiet for a long moment, stirring her soup thoughtfully. Then she rose and went to the corner where her small leather satchel sat. Juan had never asked about its contents. It seemed too personal, too close to the life she'd left behind. She returned with a folded paper, worn at the creases but carefully preserved. "There may be something we can do," she said softly, smoothing the document on the table between them. Juan leaned forward to read in the lamplight. The first page was a Union manumission paper, officially declaring Charlie Mayfield and her family free persons. But attached was a second document that made his breath catch. A land grant, signed and sealed by a Union general, awarding 160 acres to the Mayfield family in recognition of services rendered during the war. "The spring lies within these boundaries," Charlie said, her finger tracing the carefully drawn map. "If the grant still holds, the water rights are mine by law." Juan stared at her, stunned. "How long have you had this?" "Since before Charleston fell." Charlie's voice was quiet. "My father died getting these papers to safety. I've guarded them ever since, waiting for the right time, the right place." She met his eyes. "Maybe this is why God brought me here." Juan looked down at the documents again, seeing them with new understanding. This wasn't just paper and ink. It was hope, purpose, a future bought with blood and courage. He had married Charlie to save her, but now she might be the one to save their home. "What do we do?" he asked. Charlie folded her hands. "First, we pray." Juan couldn't remember the last time he'd knelt in prayer. But now he found himself on his knees beside Charlie, her quiet voice rising in the lamplight. "Lord," she prayed, "guide our steps. Show us the path of justice. Give us wisdom to know right from wrong and courage to stand firm." Her hand found his, warm and strong. "And thank you for bringing us together, that we might face this trial as one." "Amen," Juan whispered, surprising himself. They rose together. The cabin felt different somehow. No longer just a shelter, but the beginning of something worth fighting for. "I'll ride to town tomorrow," Juan said. "The preacher will know if the grant still holds legal weight. And he's a fair man. He'll give honest counsel." Charlie nodded, hope and worry mingling in her eyes. "God be with you." Juan lay awake long into the night, listening to the wind in the pines and Charlie's soft breathing from her pallet near the stove. The land grant changed everything. What had begun as an act of mercy, a marriage to save a stranger from bondage, had become something deeper. They were bound now not just by law and circumstance, but by shared purpose and destiny. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Juan rose quietly and dressed. Charlie was already awake, wrapping cornbread and bacon in a cloth for his journey. "Be careful," she said, as he mounted his horse. "Gentry might have friends in town." Juan nodded, touched by her concern. The morning was bitter cold, his breath frosting in the air as he guided his horse down the mountain trail. But inside, a warm certainty had taken root. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The sun was barely over the eastern peaks when he rode into town, heading for the small church where Preacher Harlan would be saying his morning prayers. There were answers they needed, and battles ahead. But for the first time since the war, Juan felt he was fighting for something real, not just survival, but a future worth building. The morning sun filtered through the parsonage's dusty windows as Preacher Harlan adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles. His weathered hands carefully smoothed the creased documents on his simple wooden desk. Juan stood watching, hat in hand, while the preacher's eyes moved methodically across each line. "These appear genuine," Preacher Harlan said finally, his finger tracing the official seal. "The paper, the watermarks, the general's signature, all consistent with Union documents I've seen." He looked up at Juan, his expression grave. "But Elias Gentry won't care about legitimacy. He'll only see obstacles to be removed." Juan shifted his weight, boots creaking on the wooden floor. "What kind of man is he, preacher?" The old minister sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them with a cloth. "The kind who believes progress justifies any sin. I've watched him work before, in Kansas, before I came here. He doesn't dirty his own hands, but trouble follows wherever he goes." He carefully refolded the documents. "If he learns about these papers, he'll fight dirty. Best keep them hidden for now." "Charlie thinks they're our only protection," Juan said quietly. "She may be right." Preacher Harlan handed the papers back. "But timing is everything. We'll need allies before we show our hand." He stood slowly, joints cracking. "I'll write to some legal contacts in Denver. Meanwhile, keep watch. And pray." Juan nodded, tucking the precious documents inside his coat. "Much obliged, preacher." Back at the cabin, Charlie had been busy. The morning light revealed subtle changes. Shelves straightened, floor swept clean, a bunch of late wildflowers in a tin can on the table. She worked with quiet purpose, as if each small act of domesticity was a declaration. This place was becoming home. She sat in the patch of sunlight by the window, mending one of Juan's worn shirts with neat, careful stitches. The sight caught him off guard. How naturally she seemed to fit here, as if she'd always belonged. A movement outside drew his attention. Young Billy McLean approached the cabin, clutching something in his hands. The boy had been coming by more frequently, drawn by Charlie's kindness and stories. Juan watched through the window as Charlie welcomed him with a warm smile. "What have you got there?" she asked, setting aside her mending. Billy held up a flour sack, empty except for the faded lettering. "Thought maybe you could teach me some more letters?" His voice was hopeful but shy. Charlie's face brightened. Well, now that's fine timing. I was just thinking I could use a break from these stitches. She smoothed the sack across her lap. Come sit here by the light. Juan stepped back, not wanting to interrupt. He busied himself with chores outside, checking the horses, stacking firewood, but he could hear Charlie's patient voice through the open window. See here, this letter makes the sound th, like in thank and think. Her finger traced the shapes. Now you try. Thank, Billy repeated carefully. Like when Ma says to thank the Lord? That's right. You're learning quick as anything. The afternoon light was fading when Billy finally headed home, clutching his flour sack proudly. Juan came inside to find Charlie preparing their evening meal, a simple supper of beans and cornbread, but the cabin was filled with good smells and warmth. They ate quietly, each lost in thought. The weight of the documents pressed against Juan's chest where they were hidden, a reminder of the dangers ahead. But watching Charlie across the table, he felt a fierce protectiveness rise in him. Whatever came, he wouldn't let Gentry destroy this peace they'd found. Charlie cleared the dishes, humming softly as she worked. Juan recognized it as one of her hymns, something about deliverance and safe harbor. The melody seemed to fill the cabin's corners with something holy, pushing back the gathering dark. As night settled over the mountains, Charlie spread her pallet near the stove as usual. But tonight, her whispered prayers seemed especially fervent. The hymn she sang was barely louder than breathing. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Juan lay in his own bed, listening. The song spoke of journeys through wilderness, of providence and protection. It reminded him of his own wanderings after the war, before he found this place. Now, somehow, this cabin no longer felt like just a shelter from the world. With Charlie here, it was becoming something more, a true home, worth defending. The hymn faded to silence, but its echo seemed to linger. Juan could feel it in the air, something pure and powerful, like the first snow of winter. Whatever Gentry might bring tomorrow, tonight they were safe under heaven's watch. He closed his eyes, Charlie's soft breathing mixing with the crackle of the stove. For the first time in years, he felt truly at peace. They would face what came together, guided by something stronger than fear. The last embers settled in the stove as moonlight crept across the cabin floor. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, but inside, wrapped in hymns and hope, they slept beneath the mountain's sheltering shadows. A week of autumn frost had passed when their flour ran low. Juan watched Charlie measure the last cup into her biscuit bowl that morning, her movements careful and precise. They would need to make a trip to town. I can go alone, Juan offered, knowing how the townsfolk stared and whispered. Charlie straightened her apron, chin lifting slightly. We need other things too. Might as well face them together. The ride down from their mountain perch took longer than usual. Juan found himself checking Charlie's expression as they descended, but her face remained serene. Only her fingers, tightly gripped on the reins, betrayed any tension. The main street was busy with morning traffic when they arrived. Wagons creaked past, and the blacksmith's hammer rang against iron. But as Juan helped Charlie down from her mule, the usual bustle seemed to freeze. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. Lord, give me strength, Charlie whispered, so softly Juan barely caught it. Then she squared her shoulders and walked toward McLean's general store, her steps measured and dignified. The whispers followed them like rustling leaves. There's that mountain man and his living in sin, if you ask me. Ought to be ashamed. Juan's jaw clenched, but Charlie's steady pace never faltered. The store's bell jangled as they entered. Mrs. McLean stood behind the counter, her usual cheerful greeting notably absent. A few other customers browsed the shelves, stealing glances when they thought no one was looking. Charlie moved purposefully through the store, selecting items with care: flour, salt, thread, soap. Juan followed, carrying their basket. The familiar routine felt strange under the weight of so many watching eyes. The creak of boots on wooden floorboards announced Elias Gentry's arrival. The railroad foreman filled the doorway, his elegant coat and polished boots a stark contrast to the working folks around him. His smile was sharp as a knife. "Well, well," Gentry drawled, moving closer. "If it isn't our mountain hermit and his companion." His eyes raked over Charlie with calculated disdain. "Didn't know the law allows colored landholders in these parts." The store went deadly quiet. Juan felt his muscles coil, ready for violence. But before he could move, Charlie's voice rang out, clear and steady as a church bell. "The law allows the free to live free, Mr. Gentry." She met his gaze directly, neither challenging nor submissive, just stating truth, plain as day. The silence deepened. Juan could almost hear hearts beating in the stillness. Gentry's smile twisted. "Freedom's a fancy word for folks who don't understand progress. Some might say you're standing in the way of civilization itself." Juan took a step forward, but Charlie's hand touched his arm, gentle but firm. The gesture wasn't lost on Gentry, whose face darkened with disgust. "Seems your pet mountain man needs a leash himself," Gentry sneered. Juan's vision went red. His hand started toward his belt, but suddenly Preacher Harlan was there, moving between them with surprising speed for his age. "That's enough, Elias," the preacher said firmly. "This is a place of business, not a battlefield." "Just having a friendly chat about property rights, preacher," Gentry replied smoothly. But his eyes promised future reckoning as he touched his hat and stepped back. "Good day to you all." The store's atmosphere remained tense as Charlie finished her shopping. Mrs. McLean's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped their purchases. Outside, the autumn sun seemed too bright after the store's shadowed drama. As Juan secured their goods to the mules, shame washed over him. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "Bringing you to town, I should have known better." Charlie turned to him, her dark eyes warm with something that made his chest tight. "You brought me a name," she said softly, squeezing his arm. "That's worth more than hiding." They mounted up and headed home, riding in tense silence through the golden afternoon. Each was lost in private thoughts, but something had shifted between them. Their shared defiance had forged a stronger bond than mere necessity. As they crested the final ridge before their cabin, Juan reined in sharply. Below, in the valley where the spring fed into the creek, a column of smoke rose against the sunset sky. Gentry's construction camp had arrived. Charlie's breath caught. "How many, do you reckon?" "Dozen tents, maybe more," Juan answered grimly. "Railroad crews work fast." They watched the smoke curl upward for a long moment. The camp's presence was like a dark stain on their peaceful valley, but neither spoke their fears aloud. Finally, Charlie clicked to her mule. "Best get home before dark. Those biscuits won't bake themselves." Juan nodded, following her lead. As they rode the last stretch home, he studied her straight back, her proud carriage. She had faced down Gentry's hatred without flinching, claimed her dignity in front of the whole town. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The cabin's familiar shape welcomed them as the sun sank behind the mountains. Charlie dismounted and immediately began unloading their supplies, humming one of her hymns as she worked. Juan, took care of the animals, stealing glances at her calm efficiency. Below, the construction camp's fires began to wink in the gathering dusk. But up here, in their own small sanctuary, Charlie's hymn rose sweet and clear against the evening wind. They had made their stand. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a heavy wool blanket, bringing the first true winter storm of the season. Juan stood at the cabin door, watching the sky darken ominously. The wind carried an edge sharp enough to slice through his thickest coat. Charlie worked at the stove, stirring a pot of beans while cornbread browned in the iron skillet. The cabin smelled of warmth and home, but something felt unsettled, like the stillness before lightning strikes. The sound of hooves pounding up the trail cut through the wind's howl. Juan's hand moved to his rifle, but Charlie was already at the window. "It's young Thomas from the store," she said, worry creasing her brow. The boy nearly fell from his horse, his face red from cold and exertion. "Mrs. Mayfield, Mrs. Pike," he corrected himself, gasping. "It's Billy. He's awful sick. Half the town's down with fever." Charlie's spine straightened. "What kind of fever?" "Started 3 days ago. Folks drinking from the creek where the railroad camp is. Billy's the worst." Thomas swallowed hard. "Doc says he won't last the night." Juan saw the decision in Charlie's eyes before she spoke. "I'll need my herbs," she said, already reaching for her shawl. "Storm's coming," Juan warned, though he knew it wouldn't stop her. "Then we'd best hurry." She moved with purpose, gathering her medical supplies into a worn carpet bag. "Henry's people know which herbs work best for creek fever. We'll need to stop at their camp." Juan nodded. "I'll saddle the mules." The wind had teeth by the time they reached the Ute camp. Henry emerged from his lodge, reading the urgency in their faces. Without waiting for explanation, he gestured them inside where it was warm and smoky. "Creek fever," Charlie explained quickly. "The boy Billy—" Henry's expression grew grave. "Railroad men poison water. Not mean to, but they do." He turned to his medicine stores, selecting dried plants with careful hands. "These will help, but must be prepared right way." Charlie accepted the herbs reverently. "Thank you, brother." "I go too," Henry said, already reaching for his coat. "Night like this, need good tracker." The storm caught them halfway to town. Snow drove sideways, thick enough to blind. Henry led them through the whiteness, reading the trail like a man reading his own palm. Juan kept close to Charlie, shielding her as best he could from the bitter wind. They found the McLean house in chaos. Billy lay burning with fever, his small face flushed crimson. His aunt wrung her hands helplessly while neighbors crowded the parlor, many looking sick themselves. Charlie took command of the situation with quiet authority. "Need clean water, boiled first, and fresh linens." She set her bag down and began laying out Henry's herbs. "Everyone who's not helping, please wait outside. The boy needs air." People obeyed without question, perhaps too worried to remember their prejudices. Henry built up the fire while Charlie measured herbs with careful precision. Juan watched her work, her movements sure and purposeful as she brewed the medicine. "Hold him up," she instructed Juan, bringing a cup of the steaming liquid. Billy's eyes were glazed, unseeing, but he swallowed obediently as Charlie helped him drink. Through the long night, Charlie tended the boy. She bathed his forehead with cool cloths, spooned more medicine between his cracked lips, and prayed without ceasing. Her soft hymns filled the room like healing itself. "Lord, spare this child," she whispered, hour after hour. "Let your mercy flow like clean water." Henry kept the fire stoked, brewing more medicine when needed. Juan stood guard by the door, watching snow pile against the windows. Occasionally he caught fragments of Charlie's prayers, her voice thick with exhaustion, but never wavering. Near dawn, Billy's fever broke. The first pale light of morning found him sleeping naturally, his breathing even and deep. Charlie sagged in her chair, dark circles under her eyes, but relief bright in her face. Word spread quickly through the town. As the storm eased, people began arriving with offerings, fresh bread, preserved fruits, even a precious jar of honey. Each visitor addressed Charlie formally as Mrs. Pike, speaking with new respect. Mrs. McLean hugged Charlie fiercely, tears streaming. "You saved my sister's boy," she sobbed, "after how we treated you." "The Lord's mercy flows for everyone," Charlie replied simply. Others who had taken sick came seeking help. Charlie shared the medicine freely, teaching them how to brew it properly. Henry explained about boiling water and keeping the creek clean. The railroad camp's foreman was notably absent, but no one spoke Gentry's name. It was past noon when they finally headed home. The storm had passed, leaving the world sparkling white and new. Charlie swayed with exhaustion in her saddle. Juan rode close beside her, ready to catch her if she slipped. Inside their cabin, Juan built up the fire while Charlie all but collapsed in his old rocking chair. He wrapped her in a quilt, then knelt to remove her snow-soaked boots. Her eyes were already closing. "Thank you," she murmured. Juan looked up at her face, peaceful in near sleep, and felt something shift deep in his chest. This woman who had faced down prejudice with dignity, who had ridden through a blizzard to save a child, who filled his lonely cabin with hymns and grace. She was a miracle. His miracle. The love that washed over him was as vast as the snow-covered mountains, as warm as the fire crackling in their hearth. He didn't have words to express it. Instead, he gently tucked the quilt around her feet and rose to make her tea. Charlie's breathing had deepened into sleep. Outside, the late afternoon sun turned the snow-laden pines to gold. Juan stood watching her, his heart full of wonder at how mercy could transform not just a town, but a solitary man's soul. The cabin was warm, the storm was past, and his wife was safely home. For now, that was everything. The mountain night lay peaceful and cold around Juan and Charlie's cabin. Moonlight silvered the fresh snow, and a gentle wind whispered through the pines. Inside, the dying embers in the stove cast a faint orange glow across the rough-hewn walls. Juan slept fitfully, his arm draped protectively across Charlie's shoulders. A bitter, acrid smell jolted him awake. Smoke. Not the familiar scent of wood smoke from their stove, but the choking stench of destruction. Heat pressed against the cabin walls like a living thing. "Charlie!" Juan shook her shoulder hard. "Wake up!" She stirred, then sat bolt upright as the smoke hit her lungs. Already orange flames were licking through the gaps between the logs, turning their sanctuary into an inferno. The roof timbers groaned ominously. Juan grabbed Charlie's arm and pulled her from the bed. "Out! Now!" They stumbled towards the door, but the smoke was thick as wool, burning their eyes and throats. Charlie doubled over, coughing violently. Juan wrapped his arm around her waist, half carrying her as flames roared up the walls. The door stuck in its frame, swollen by the heat. Juan slammed his shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times before it burst open. They tumbled into the snow-covered yard just as a tremendous crack split the night. The roof collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks toward the star-filled sky. Charlie tried to run back toward the burning cabin. "The deed! My papers!" "No!" Juan caught her around the waist, holding her back as their home became a funeral pyre for everything they owned. Her precious documents, his father's Bible, the quilt she had started piecing together from scraps, all of it feeding the hungry flames. The spring glowed crimson in the firelight, its usually clear surface reflecting the destruction like a mirror of blood. Charlie buried her face in Juan's chest, her shoulders shaking with sobs. He held her close, his own eyes burning from more than just smoke. Heavy footsteps crunched in the snow behind them. Juan whirled, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, but it was Henry's familiar silhouette that emerged from the darkness. The Ute Scout's face was grim as he studied the burning cabin. "Saw the flames from my camp," Henry said quietly. "Came as fast as I could." He knelt in the snow, examining marks that Juan's eyes couldn't make out in the darkness. 3 men were here, boots with iron tips, railroad crew boots, Gentry's men. Juan's hands clenched into fists. Of course it was Gentry. The railroad foreman had warned them, hadn't he? All accessible water, he'd said, and now their home was ashes, their legal claim to the spring destroyed, along with Charlie's papers. "I'll kill him," Juan growled, the words tasting like smoke in his mouth. "Him and every man who helped him do this." Charlie's hand found his arm, gripping tight despite her trembling. "Don't meet hate with hate," she whispered, her voice rough from smoke and tears. "Please, Juan, violence won't rebuild our home." "She speaks wisdom," Henry said, still studying the tracks. "Gentry wants you to fight, wants excuse to have Marshall arrest you." But rage burned hot in Juan's chest, hotter than the flames consuming their cabin. He thought of Charlie's face when she'd first seen their home, how she'd transformed the bare cabin into something close to heaven with her hymns and gentle ways. Now it was all gone, destroyed by men who saw nothing sacred in anything they couldn't own. "We need shelter," Henry said practically. "Storm coming again. Church is closest." Juan nodded numbly. The cold was already biting through their nightclothes, and Charlie couldn't stop shivering. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Henry led them down the trail, his keen eyes finding safe passage even in the dark. Behind them, the cabin continued to burn, its light fading as they descended toward town. Charlie stumbled, exhausted and half frozen. Juan lifted her into his arms, carrying her the rest of the way. The church windows glowed warm yellow. Preacher Harlan was already awake, probably roused by the same fire glow that had drawn Henry. He opened the parsonage door before they could knock. "Lord have mercy," the preacher breathed, taking in their smoke-stained faces and scanty clothing. Come in quickly." Inside, the preacher's wife wrapped Charlie in blankets while Harlan poured cups of strong coffee with shaking hands. "I'll send word to the marshal," he said. "This is a crime, plain and simple." "No proof," Henry said quietly. "Tracks in snow already filling up. Gentry not foolish enough to leave evidence." Juan stood at the window, gripping his rifle, rescued from its place by the door before the flames took it. His trigger finger itched. 1 bullet for Gentry, 1 each for the men who helped him. Simple justice, frontier style. But Charlie's soft weeping drew him from thoughts of vengeance. She sat huddled in her blankets, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. This woman who had faced down hatred with dignity, who had nursed the town's sick children, who had taught him that grace was stronger than bitterness, she needed him now. The rifle felt heavy in his hands. He looked at it for a long moment, remembering all the death he'd seen in the war. More killing wouldn't heal anything. Slowly, deliberately, Juan set the rifle aside. He crossed the room and knelt beside Charlie's chair, taking her small hands in his rough ones. "Pray with me," he asked hoarsely. Charlie's eyes widened. In all their time together, he had listened to her prayers but never offered one himself. She squeezed his hands and bowed her head. "Lord," Juan began hesitantly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. We need We need strength, not for fighting, for forgiving, for rebuilding. His voice grew stronger. Thank you for saving our lives. Thank you for friends who shelter us. Help us remember your mercy, even now. Amen, Charlie whispered, and the simple word held more power than any bullet. Outside, the first flakes of new snow began to fall, covering the tracks that led to their burning home. But inside the parsonage, a different kind of flame was kindling, one that no hatred could extinguish. Juan held Charlie close as dawn's first light crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered town in shades of hope. 3 days after the fire, the morning stillness shattered with shouts from the mine. Men rushed through the streets, their voices carrying news that chilled the winter air. Elias Gentry lay dead, crushed beneath fallen timbers in the new railroad tunnel. Word spread like wildfire through the town. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the marshal's office, their angry voices rising above the wind. Through the parsonage window, Charlie watched them with growing dread. "Pike must have done it," someone shouted. "Revenge for burning his cabin." "Saw him riding near the tunnel yesterday," another added. The mob swelled, feeding on its own fury. Marshal Burns emerged from his office, his badge catching the weak sunlight. The crowd surged forward, demanding justice. Charlie gripped the windowsill until her knuckles went white. "Juan was here all morning," she whispered, "helping repair the church roof." Preacher Harlan laid a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Truth won't matter to them right now. They need someone to blame." The sound of hoofbeats made them turn. Juan rode up the street, returning from checking their ruined cabin site. The crowd fell silent at his approach, parting like water around a stone. Marshal Burns stepped forward, his hand resting on his pistol. "Juan Pike," he called out, voice carrying in the winter air. "You're under arrest for the murder of Elias Gentry." "What?" Juan's face showed genuine shock. "I haven't been near the tunnel." "We have witnesses say different." The marshal's voice was flat, professional. "Best come quiet." Charlie burst from the parsonage door. "He's innocent. Juan was here, ask the preacher." But the mob's angry muttering drowned her protests. Marshal Burns moved forward, iron cuffs glinting in his hands. Juan could have spurred his horse, could have fought, but Charlie saw the moment he chose peace instead. He dismounted slowly, holding his empty hands where everyone could see them. "The law will sort this out," Juan said, his eyes finding Charlie's across the crowd. "Trust in the truth." The marshal locked the cuffs around Juan's wrists. Charlie tried to reach him, but the crowd pressed close, blocking her path. She watched helplessly as they led him away to the jailhouse. That evening, snow began to fall, thick flakes muffling the town's usual sounds. Charlie knelt in the street outside the jail, her voice lifting in prayer despite the bitter cold. "Lord, protect the innocent," she prayed. "Let truth prevail over fear." Inside his cell, Juan pressed close to the barred window, letting her words wash over him. The cell was cold, the thin blanket offering little comfort. But Charlie's voice kept him warm, kept him hoping. Each morning before dawn, Charlie returned to her vigil. Some townspeople hurled insults as they passed. "Praying won't free a murderer. Go back where you came from." But Charlie remained unmoved, her prayers steady as the mountain wind. Hours passed as she knelt in the deepening snow, her faith a challenge to those who watched. Inside the cell, Juan paced, 4 steps forward, 4 steps back. The walls seemed to close in tighter each day. Only Charlie's voice through the window kept him from despair. "I didn't kill him," he told Marshal Burns through the bars. "Gentry was a snake, but I chose mercy, not murder." The marshal's face showed doubt, but also weariness. Tunnel collapse could have been natural, he admitted, but folks need someone to blame. You're the easiest target. Each evening, Preacher Harlan came to the jail, bringing food for Juan and escort for Charlie. The preacher's presence protected her from the worst of the mob's anger, though whispers followed them through the streets. But as days passed, something began to shift in the town's mood. They watched Charlie's unwavering devotion, her quiet dignity in the face of scorn. Some who had jeered now passed in respectful silence. Others began leaving food at the parsonage door. Mrs. McLean from the general store stopped one morning, standing awkward but determined beside Charlie's kneeling form. "I reckon a guilty man's wife wouldn't pray so hard," she said softly, then hurried away. The snow continued falling, blanketing the town in white silence. Charlie's dark figure against the pristine snow became a familiar sight, her prayers a constant witness to both faith and love. Inside his cell, Juan pressed his forehead against the cold bars. "Why do you stay?" he asked Charlie during one of her visits. "Why endure their hatred?" Charlie reached through the bars to touch his face. "Because love is stronger than iron," she said, "and truth will outlast lies." The preacher brought news each evening, how some townsfolk now questioned Gentry's death, how others remembered his cruelty and wondered if the tunnel's collapse wasn't God's judgment rather than man's revenge. "Your wife's prayers do more than my sermons," Preacher Harlan told Juan. "She shows them what faith really means." Juan's hope had faltered in the long, cold hours of confinement. But Charlie's voice floated through his window each dawn, reminding him that light always returned to scattered darkness. The marshal watched, too, his lined face troubled. He saw how Charlie knelt in the snow, unmoved by cold or criticism, saw how Juan bore his imprisonment with quiet dignity rather than rage. Doubt began to gnaw at his certainty. "A guilty man's wife weeps and wails," Burns muttered to himself. "She doesn't pray for her enemies' souls." Days stretched into weeks. Charlie's knees were bruised from kneeling, her voice hoarse from prayers. But still she came. Still she witnessed. The town watched and wondered, and slowly, hearts began to thaw like spring snow. Juan leaned his head against the cell wall, listening to Charlie's voice rise above the morning sounds of the awakening town. Her faith had become his anchor, her prayers the rhythm that marked his days. Through the bars, he watched the snow continue falling, covering the town in a blanket of pristine white, as if waiting for truth to finally emerge from beneath winter's shroud. Henry stood at the edge of the burned cabin site, his weathered face grim against the biting wind. Snow had begun falling again, dusting the blackened timbers with white. His keen eyes studied the ground, reading signs others would miss. "My brother Juan does not kill from shadow," he muttered, crouching to examine boot prints preserved in frozen mud. "He faces enemies straight, like a warrior." The Ute tracker moved methodically through the ruins, his moccasins silent on the snow-covered ash. Where others saw only destruction, Henry saw stories written in the wreckage. He noted how the fire had burned hottest at the corners, not the center where a natural blaze would typically start. The winter wind carried memories of shared campfires, of Juan tending his wounds after a mountain lion attack, of quiet conversations under star-filled skies. Henry's loyalty ran deeper than mere friendship. It was a bond forged through years of trust and mutual respect. Down in the town, Charlie knelt in her usual spot outside the jailhouse. Her thin shawl offered little protection against the cruel mountain winter. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her prayers came in visible puffs of frost. "Lord, guide those who seek truth," she whispered, her voice growing hoarser each day. "Light the path to justice." Inside his cell, Juan pressed close to the window bars, straining to catch every word. Her voice had become his lifeline, keeping hope alive in the long, dark hours. At night, her hymns followed him into troubled dreams, sometimes clear as morning bells, sometimes faint as distant wind. Preacher Harlan approached Charlie, carrying a steaming cup of coffee and a worn blanket. "Please, Mrs. Pike," he urged, draping the blanket around her shoulders. "You'll catch your death out here." Charlie accepted the coffee with trembling hands but shook her head. "Not while truth lies buried," she said firmly. "My discomfort is nothing compared to an innocent man's chains." The preacher sighed, knowing argument was useless. He had watched her grow weaker each day, yet her spirit seemed to strengthen even as her body failed. The sight of her kneeling in the snow had begun to shame those who had been quickest to condemn. Up at the ruined cabin, Henry worked tirelessly. He sifted through ash, studied broken glass, and read the story of that terrible night in ways only his people's wisdom could teach. As the second day dawned, he found something that made his breath catch, a scrap of leather with an unfamiliar mark. "Spirits of my fathers," he murmured, "guide my eyes to what must be found." The third morning broke clear and cold. In his cell, Juan woke from dreams of Charlie singing. The familiar sound of her prayers drifted through his window, but something was different, weaker, strained. Fear clutched his heart, knowing the toll her vigil was taking. Suddenly, hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Henry's paint horse appeared through the swirling snow, its rider carrying something wrapped in a cloth. The tracker rode straight past the jail, past Charlie's kneeling form, toward the white-steepled church. Charlie struggled to her feet, hope giving her strength. She followed Henry's trail through the snow, Preacher Harlan hurrying to support her arm. Other townspeople emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the purposeful intensity of Henry's arrival. Inside the church, Henry carefully unwrapped his burden, a charred tin box, its lock still intact despite the fire's heat. The preacher gasped in recognition. "That's my strongbox," Charlie whispered. "It held the deed, but how?" "Found it buried under floorboards," Henry explained, his English careful and precise. "Fire did not touch it there. Someone dug up boards, hid box before setting flames." His dark eyes met Charlie's. "Man who burns home in anger does not take time to hide things first. This was planned. Your Juan, he would not do such a thing." The preacher examined the box closely. "If the deed survived—" "Marshall needs to see this," Charlie said, new strength in her voice. "Henry, will you tell him what you found?" The tracker nodded solemnly. "We'll tell all I read in ash and snow. We'll speak of marks that show 3 men, not 1. We'll show leather piece from boot not made for these mountains." Charlie swayed slightly, exhaustion finally overtaking her. The preacher guided her to a pew as Henry strode out, carrying the box toward the marshal's office. Through the church windows, they could see more townspeople gathering, word of Henry's discovery spreading quickly. "Rest now, child," Preacher Harlan said gently. "You've kept faith through the darkest hours. Let others carry the burden for a while." Charlie leaned back against the rough wood of the pew, her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. "Thank you for not forsaking us." Morning light streamed through the church's windows, catching the tin box in Henry's hands as he spoke with the marshal. Its dull surface seemed to glow, like truth, finally, emerging from shadow into day. Morning sunlight streamed through the church windows as townspeople filed in, drawn by the news of Henry's discovery. The rough-hewn pews filled quickly with miners, shopkeepers, and ranchers, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Charlie sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in prayer, while Preacher Harlan stood beside her like a protective father. The marshal arrived last, his spurs jangling against the wooden floor. He carried his ring of jail keys, twisting them nervously in his weathered hands. Henry waited at the altar, the charred tin box placed carefully on a small table before him. The tracker's calm presence commanded attention, his dignified bearing a stark contrast to the restless crowd. "Friends and neighbors," Preacher Harlan's voice rang out, bringing quiet to the murmuring congregation. "We gather to witness truth long buried. Henry, please show us what you found." Henry stepped forward, his movements deliberate and measured. The box's hinges creaked as he opened it, the sound echoing in the hushed church. Inside, protected from the fire's fury, lay several documents. With careful hands, he lifted out the topmost paper, its edges blackened but its center intact. The preacher took the document, holding it up so all could see. Sunlight caught the remnants of a golden seal, the unmistakable mark of the Union Army. Below it, Charlie's name stood clear: Charlotte Mayfield, freedwoman. "This deed," Preacher Harlan announced, his voice strong with conviction, "bears the signature of a Union general and the presidential seal. It grants the spring and surrounding acres to the Mayfield family as payment for services rendered during the war." A collective gasp rippled through the church. Mrs. McLean from the general store pressed a hand to her mouth. Billy's mother pulled him closer, her face flushed with shame at past unkindness. "The land and the spring belong to the Mayfield family," the preacher declared, "by law and by right." Charlie stood slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her voice carrying in the stillness. "Thank you for bringing truth to light." The marshal stepped forward, keys jingling. "Reckon I owe some folks an apology," he said gruffly. "Henry, would you walk with me to the jail? Time to right a wrong." The crowd followed as Henry and the marshal led the way to the jailhouse. Charlie walked between Preacher Harlan and Billy's mother, who kept apologizing softly. The morning air was crisp, but the sun had begun to warm the street, making the snow on the rooftops weep gentle tears. At the jail, the marshal's hands shook slightly as he fitted the key into the lock. The cell door opened with a metallic groan, and Juan Pike stepped into the sunlight. His face was rough with beard growth, his clothes wrinkled from weeks in the cell, but his eyes sought only Charlie. They moved toward each other like leaves drawn by wind. Juan gathered Charlie in his arms, holding her as if she might disappear. She pressed her face against his chest, her tears dampening his shirt. Around them, the townspeople watched in respectful silence, many wiping their own eyes at the sight. "I never lost faith," Charlie murmured against Juan's chest. "Not for one moment." Juan stroked her hair gently, his own eyes glistening. "Your prayers kept me alive," he whispered. "I heard you every day, every night." Henry approached the couple, holding out the tin box. "Your proof of ownership, Mrs. Pike," he said formally. "Safe as promised." Charlie took the box with trembling hands, then surprised Henry by embracing him. "Thank you, brother," she said softly, using the Ute word for kinsman. Henry's weathered face softened at the gesture. The marshal cleared his throat. "Mr. Pike, Mrs. Pike," he began awkwardly. "On behalf of the law in this town, I apologize for the grave injustice done to you both." More townspeople stepped forward. Mrs. McLean offered fresh bread and preserves. The blacksmith promised to help rebuild their cabin. Billy's mother spoke of teaching positions at the new school. Each gesture of reconciliation seemed to lift the weight of winter from the air. Snow continued melting from the rooftops, dripping steadily like nature's own testimony. The sun climbed higher, warming the street where Charlie had knelt in prayer so many cold mornings. Now she stood tall beside her husband, their shadows merging on the thawing ground. "If you're willing," Preacher Harlan said, "I'd like to hold a special service, to ask God's forgiveness for our hasty judgment and to properly celebrate your rightful claim to the land." Juan looked at Charlie, who nodded. "We would be honored," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let us turn hatred to healing, as the Lord teaches." The townspeople began dispersing, talking quietly among themselves about plans for the service and the cabin rebuilding. The marshal walked away with bowed head, his limp more pronounced under the burden of regret. Henry mounted his paint horse, satisfied that justice had been served. Juan and Charlie remained standing in the street, still holding each other. Above them, the last of the snow dripped from the rooftops, as if winter itself surrendered to the warmth of truth and reconciliation. The sun bathed them in golden light, a blessing more powerful than any human judgment. "Your faith brought us through," Juan said softly, touching Charlie's cheek. She smiled up at him, her eyes shining. "Our faith," she corrected gently, "and his mercy." Around them, the town stirred with new purpose, women planning meals for the rebuilding, men discussing lumber and nails, children running to spread the news of Juan's release. The morning had dawned with truth, and with it came the promise of a community transformed by grace. The charred tin box in Charlie's hands held more than just a deed. It contained proof that justice could prevail, that prayer could move hearts, that love could overcome prejudice. As she and Juan walked toward the church, following Preacher Harlan to discuss the service, their footsteps left clear prints in the melting snow, marks of freedom, finally and fully claimed. The mountain released winter's grip slowly that year. First came the whisper of warming winds, then the steady drip of melting snow from pine boughs. By early March, patches of muddy earth emerged like islands in the white sea of snow, and the spring's voice grew stronger, bubbling up through softening ground. Juan Pike stood at the edge of their burned cabin site, watching as townsmen arrived with wagons loaded with fresh-cut timber. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trampled snow, and steam rose from coffee cups clutched in gloved hands. The scene before him seemed impossible just weeks ago. Neighbors coming together, purpose replacing prejudice. Charlie emerged from the temporary shelter they'd built, carrying a basket of fresh biscuits. Her bright smile drew the workers like moths to flame. "Breakfast for those willing to bend their backs," she called out, and the men gathered round, stamping their boots and breathing clouds into the crisp air. The blacksmith, Tom Cooper, unrolled building plans on a makeshift table. "Figured we'd start with the spring house," he said, pointing to the drawings. "Get the water flowing proper before tackling the cabin." Juan nodded, studying the plans. The design was simple but sturdy. Stone foundation, tight-fitted boards, a proper roof to protect the precious water source. More than they'd had before, but nothing fancy. Just right. As men began clearing debris, Charlie touched Juan's arm. "I'm headed to town for the first school day," she said softly. "Billy's mother helped arrange the church hall." He caught her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll bring water later," he promised. The daily ritual had become sacred to them both. His delivery of spring water to her classroom, a reminder of how their lives had merged like two streams joining. Throughout the morning, the worksite hummed with activity. Henry arrived with several Ute men, skilled woodworkers who knew how to make lumber sing. They set to work shaping support beams, their quiet efficiency drawing admiration from the town crew. The spring house took shape quickly under many hands. Stone by stone, board by board, the structure rose from the earth like a prayer answered. Juan worked alongside the others, his usual solitude forgotten in the rhythm of shared labor. By midday, the foundation stood solid, and the frame reached toward the sky. In town, Charlie arranged the church hall with borrowed tables and chairs. Her first students arrived shyly, miners' children in patched clothes, 3 Ute children in beautifully beaded moccasins, and Billy, proudly carrying a new slate. She welcomed each one with dignity, beginning their day with a hymn that filled the hall with hope. As promised, Juan arrived at noon, carrying 2 wooden buckets of spring water. The children watched wide-eyed as he poured it into the earthenware cooler, the clear liquid catching sunlight like diamonds. Charlie touched his sleeve in silent thanks, and for a moment they stood together, watching their dream of community take shape in these small faces eager to learn. The weeks flowed by like the spring itself, steady, purposeful, life-giving. The spring house was completed first, its new pump gleaming in the strengthening sun. Then attention turned to the cabin, built larger than before, with proper windows and a stone chimney that would draw smoke true. Railroad men came too, led by the new foreman who replaced Gentry. They brought papers and compensation, fair payment for access to the spring's clean water. The agreement, witnessed by Preacher Harlan, ensured that Sanctuary Hollow would have a reliable water supply, with the Pikes as rightful stewards of the source. Charlie's school flourished like wildflowers after rain. She taught reading and figures, yes, but also dignity and respect. The children learned to see past skin color and language differences, sharing stories and games in the sunny churchyard. Their laughter echoed through the valley, healing old wounds with innocent joy. One bright April morning, as daffodils pushed through the last patches of snow, the town gathered again at the spring. A new sign stood ready, crafted by the blacksmith and painted by Mrs. McLean herself. Preacher Harlan raised his hands for silence, and the crowd stilled. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying on the spring breeze, "we gather to bless this place. Mayfield Spring. Once it was just water from the ground, but now it has become something more. A symbol of grace, of healing, of community renewed." Charlie stood close to Juan, their fingers intertwined. She watched as the same faces that once twisted with scorn now shone with genuine warmth. The marshal, his badge gleaming, nodded respectfully. Billy's mother wiped happy tears. Henry stood with his Ute kinsman, their presence a bridge between worlds. "Mayfield Spring," Preacher Harlan continued, "gift of grace, 1881. May its waters remind us always that God's mercy flows fresh each morning, washing away our prejudices, nourishing new growth in our hearts." The sign was raised, its letters gleaming gold in the spring sunshine. A cheer went up from the crowd, echoing off the mountainside. Men who had once mocked Juan now stepped forward to shake his hand, their grips firm with respect, earned through shared labor and understanding. Mrs. McLean brought forth a feast spread on makeshift tables, fried chicken, fresh bread, pies cooling in the mountain air. Children played near the spring house, their games watched over by smiling parents. Ute elders shared stories translated by Henry, weaving their wisdom into the valley's new story. Juan found Charlie, standing by the spring, her hand trailing in the clear water. "Did you ever think," she asked softly, "that day in town when you spoke up for me, that we'd end up here?" He shook his head, drawing her close. "Reckon I just knew I couldn't let injustice stand. Never dreamed we'd build all this." He gestured to the school children playing, the neighbors sharing food, the spring house standing proud against the mountains. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Charlie said, smiling. "He took our small act of faith and multiplied it like loaves and fishes." Around them, the valley buzzed with life and promise. The spring song merged with children's laughter, with women's gossip, with men's deep discussions of crops and weather. It was the sound of community, not perfect, but healing, growing, learning to flow together like the waters that gave them life. The new sign caught the afternoon light, its words a testament to transformation. Mayfield Spring, Gift of Grace, 1881. Below it the waters flowed clear and sweet, offering refreshment to all who came, a blessing freely given, like the love that had made it possible. 10 years had weathered the sign at Mayfield Spring, its gold letters faded but still proud against the weathered wood. The morning sun caught the fresh paint on the church steeple, bright white against the clear Colorado sky. Summer wildflowers dotted the path where Juan and Charlie Pike walked hand in hand toward the Sunday service. Juan's dark hair had threads of silver now, earned through years of working the land and helping neighbors. His steps were slower but purposeful, matching Charlie's gentle pace. She wore her best dress, blue cotton with tiny flowers, and her smile remained as radiant as the day he'd first brought her to these mountains. Children darted past them, clutching freshly printed hymn sheets that fluttered like dove wings in the morning breeze. Their laughter echoed across the valley, children of miners, merchants, and Ute families, all heading to worship together. Some called out greetings to Teacher Charlie, while others tipped their hats respectfully to Juan. Above them, the church bell began to ring, its familiar crack adding character to each peal. Billy McLean, no longer the sickly boy they'd nursed through fever, but a tall young man of 21, pulled the rope with practiced ease. His strong hands had helped rebuild half the town over the years, starting with their cabin when he was just 11. "Morning, Mr. and Mrs. Pike," Billy called down from the bell tower, his smile bright against his sun-bronzed face. "Saved your usual spot up front." Charlie squeezed Juan's hand. "Thank you, Billy. Your mama coming today?" "Yes'm. She's bringing that peach cobbler you love." They climbed the church steps, worn smooth by thousands of faithful feet. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting rainbow patterns from the simple stained glass onto the wooden pews. Dust motes danced, in the colored beams like silent prayers rising. Preacher Harlan, his beard now completely white, stood at the door greeting his flock. He clasped Juan's shoulder warmly. "Brother Pike," he said, then turned to Charlie with genuine affection. "Sister Pike, you'll be reading for us today?" Charlie nodded, patting the Bible she carried. "Psalm 23, she said. Seemed fitting, with the spring running so strong this year." Inside, the church filled quickly. Where once there had been suspicious glances and carefully maintained distance, now sat a true community. Mrs. McLean, who'd once refused to meet Juan's eyes in her store, waved them over to share her pew. Henry's grandson, wearing his grandfather's beaded necklace, sat nearby with his young wife, their baby sleeping peacefully in a beautifully crafted cradle board. The morning light poured through the windows as the congregation settled. Billy finished his bell-ringing duties and slipped into place beside his mother, who had tears in her eyes, watching her son. The same boy who'd nearly died of fever now stood tall and strong, a living testament to Charlie's healing hands and faithful prayers. When Charlie rose to read, the church fell respectfully silent. Her voice, clear and strong, carried to every corner. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Juan bowed his head, his heart so full it ached. The familiar words washed over him like spring water, clean and pure. He remembered that desperate day at the auction, how he'd acted on impulse and righteousness, never dreaming where that choice would lead. Now, listening to his wife's voice ring with quiet authority through the church they'd helped build, he felt the full measure of God's grace. Charlie's reading continued, each word carrying the weight of their shared journey. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Memories flickered through Juan's mind. The burning cabin, his time in jail, Charlie kneeling in prayer outside his cell, the long nights of doubt and fear transformed by morning light into opportunities for mercy. The spring, always the spring, flowing clean and true through every season of their lives. After the service, while others gathered for Sunday dinner on the church lawn, Juan and Charlie walked to their special spot beside the spring house. The water caught sunlight as it bubbled from the earth, diamonds dancing on the surface. Charlie's hand found his again, her touch as familiar as his own heartbeat. "They mocked us once," she said softly, looking out over the valley where their story had unfolded. The town spread below them, peaceful in the Sunday quiet. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in dusty yards, and the railroad tracks gleamed like silver threads connecting them to the wider world. Juan smiled, drawing her close. "Let him," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "We showed him what love can build." His free hand gestured to the schoolhouse, where Charlie still taught 3 days a week. The new houses that had sprung up around the spring, the gardens irrigated by the water they shared freely. The wind carried the sound of hymns singing down the valley, voices raised in joy and praise. Among them, they could pick out Billy's strong tenor, Mrs. McLean's sweet alto, the deeper tones of the miners who'd helped rebuild their home. All voices blending together, like streams joining to form a mighty river. Charlie leaned her head against Juan's shoulder, her silver-streaked hair catching the sunlight. Below them, the water flowed on, eternal as God's mercy, a testament to what faith and forgiveness could accomplish. The spring that had once been a source of conflict now nourished the entire valley, its waters binding them together in ways no law or custom could match. "Remember that first night?" Juan asked softly. "When you blessed our supper and sang that old hymn?" Charlie nodded against his shoulder. "I was so scared," she admitted. "But something in my heart knew to trust you. Knew God had brought us together for a purpose." "Reckon he did at that," Juan agreed, watching a young Ute mother fill her water bucket while her toddler played in the grass nearby. The woman smiled and waved, the daughter of Henry's cousin, now married to one of Billy's friends from the mines. The morning eased toward noon, the summer sun warming the mountainside. From their perch by the spring, they could see their cabin, solid and welcoming with its stone chimney and flourishing garden. The sign still stood proud. Mayfield Spring, Gift of Grace, 1881, its message more true with each passing year. Charlie's students had added their own touch, a small flower garden around the spring house, blooming with columbine and wild roses. Each blossom represented a child who'd learned to read and write under her patient guidance, their futures brightened by education and understanding. The church bell rang again, Billy calling everyone to the Sunday feast. But Juan and Charlie lingered a moment longer, watching the water flow. It caught the light and threw it back to the sky, endless and beautiful, like love itself. "Shall we join them?" Charlie asked at last, but Juan held her hand a moment longer, savoring the peace they'd built together. "In a minute," he said softly. The wind carried the sound of church singing down the valley, a melody of redemption and joy. The water flowed on, eternal as God's grace, while above them the Colorado sky stretched endless and blue, promising more days of beauty yet to come. The silver moonlight bathed the mountains in a ghostly glow as Juan and Charlie sat beside the spring, their lantern casting a warm circle around them. The day's celebrations had faded into night, leaving only the soft chorus of crickets and the eternal song of flowing water. Their weathered faces, reflected in the spring's surface, each line and crease telling stories of trials weathered and joys shared. The creak of wagon wheels broke the evening's peace. Henry's familiar silhouette appeared on the ridge, his movements slower now with age, but still carrying the dignity of his people. In his arms, he cradled a wooden plaque, its surface smoothed by careful hands and decorated with carved symbols of water and hope. "The mountain asked me to bring this," Henry said, his voice gentle in the night air. The plaque's words caught the lantern light. "Grace flows where mercy dared." Together they mounted it on the spring house wall. The fresh pine wood gleamed against the weathered boards, a new chapter in their shared story. Henry's dark eyes reflected wisdom as he settled beside them, accepting a cup of coffee from Charlie's hands. "The mountain remembers kindness," Henry said, his words mixing with the spring's murmur. "It gives back what's sown." He spoke of his tribe's dreams, land their grandfathers had walked, valleys where their children should grow. Juan nodded, his voice firm with promise. "I'll help file the petition in town tomorrow. It's time for more healing." After Henry's wagon disappeared into the darkness, Charlie leaned against Juan's shoulder, her voice soft with memory. "We began with chains," she whispered, "but God made us stewards instead." The first light of dawn painted the valley in pale gold as Juan filled 2 tin cups from the spring. The water caught the light like liquid diamonds as he handed one to Charlie. "To freedom," he said, "earned and kept." The spring burbled its ancient song, eternal witness to love's power to redeem, to mercy's strength to heal, to grace that flowed as freely as the water itself. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.